Over half of the air we breathe comes from the ocean. And what do these sands of the Sahara contain? They contain fish bones, the remains of fish bones from the time when the Sahara was not a desert but a swamp. Even eels, which are on the verge of extinction and are the subject of fishing that hardly brings any profit to anyone. Well, we can't manage to shut down this fishing. A lot of fish make noise. We talk about a world of silence, but actually not at all. There are sharks today that have eaten Vikings and are still swimming. They feed on dead animals, so a Viking who falls into the water probably tastes the same as a dead seal they usually eat.
Hello everyone. Today we're diving into the secret world of oceans and rivers with Bill Francois. Hello Bill Francois, hello, we're very happy to have you on the show. This is the first time I've had trouble introducing someone because we've had physicists, we've had biologists, but now you're kind of in between the two. How could we define you?
Yes, I'm interested in biophysics, so physics applied to the living world and more at large scales. Because when we talk about biophysics, we mostly think about the small mechanisms inside cells. That's the term we usually use to refer to the study of small biological things, but for me it's more about big things, large objects. So animals, plants, how they work, and they follow physical laws because actually physics is everywhere, including in living things.
All right, so for example, that means studying what? The way fish move?
For example, typically, that's it, I did my thesis on that, the movement of fish in schools of fish. So that follows physical laws then. We can look at it from a biologist's point of view by seeing how different species of fish move for reproduction, to escape predators for their lives. Also try to eventually understand inside each fish what anatomical mechanisms make them move. That's the biological point of view. It's generally a zoom inwards, looking in detail at the small differences between species, etc. Then there's the physicist's point of view. It's more about zooming out, just for fun. Physicists often say that a cow is spherical because if you want to model a cow, you first pretend it's a sphere. And at first, you'll already be able to calculate a whole bunch of things pretty accurately without needing to go to a higher level of precision and consider the legs, the shape, and so on. It's kind of the same with the physicist's point of view on how fish move. The idea is to simplify the problem, to model it in a simple way, forces, energies, and so on, and to be able to understand some major unifying laws that way.
All right, so you said that you studied how fish move. Was it a particular species?
Exactly. So the biological perspective would be to focus on a particular species. The physicist's perspective was more about trying to find general laws. But obviously we can't escape the diversity of nature, so since it was experimental, we had to study particular species. We worked on several species, small aquarium fish like the zebrafish, so these are small tropical freshwater fish. The zebrafish is kind of like the laboratory mouse, but in fish form. It's a fish whose genome has been sequenced and on which we have a lot of transgenic forms that are used for laboratory experiments. We know how to raise it very well in a very controlled, very standard way. So it's kind of what biologists call animal models. That allows us to model things like that. We worked on zebrafish because they were easy to get in aquariums. But we also worked on North American marine fish. On the west coast of North America, they're called Cimatogaster aggregata, which don't really have a French name. It's a kind of marine perch. It looks a bit like a gray sea bream. And what's special about them is that they're viviparous, so they give birth to live young, just like us. They didn't go through eggs and larval embryos because most fish are born from tiny eggs and go through a whole metamorphosis. Here, the young would come out almost half the size of the adult. And actually, that meant that over 2 generations, we really had very standard sizes of individuals, and that allowed us to study how they swim together. Does size play a role? Do the small ones follow the big ones? Do the big ones follow the small ones? And so on.
All right, so that's going to be extremely interesting, and it's true that this is a field, I think, that we don't necessarily talk about. That much, I'm going to look at a study that asked questions to children, and some of them tended to draw, when they were asked to draw fish, little squares of breaded fish. And it's true that maybe we're a little less connected to the marine world, maybe because we see it less. We can walk around, walk in a forest, we can see animals, maybe they're animals we're less exposed to. Is there really a whole world of life inside forests and streams?
Absolutely, there's life. And it's true that it's a world we don't really see much of. I think for this study on children, elementary school kids, about 20% or more couldn't tell the difference. Well, they just couldn't. The connection actually between the fish we eat, so this square-shaped food, and the animal, the fish, they usually know both, but they don't make the distinction. So when we ask them to draw a fish, if we don't specify which one, they might draw the square just as much as the other. Exactly, it really shows how disconnected we are from that world. And it's not that this world doesn't affect us, it's that we're disconnected from it. That is the ocean. More than 1 out of every 2 breaths we take, we owe to the ocean. We talk a lot about the forest, and it's very important, but I'm not saying this to take anything away from the forest. But phytoplankton are these microscopic plants that live in the sea. It's what gives us more than one. It's our biggest ally against global warming. It's the whole functioning of the planet. It's 75% of the surface of the globe, so above all, it's the planet of the sea before it's the planet Earth. We're just little islanders on our continents actually, but basically the Earth is the ocean, and as a result, it constantly influences us in many ways. A very concrete example is the fish we eat, and we've pretty much cut off that connection. It's one of the last ones. Animals, fish, when we eat them, we still more or less have the shape of the animal in mind. But even then, there aren't many people left who buy whole fish at the fish market. And actually, that's how we forget the importance of this whole world and all the richness it can have. It's even worse for rivers, which are right near our homes, but we don't look at them at all. And yet, these are worlds full of life, full of richness, major centers of biodiversity. The oceans as well as the rivers, actually.
Okay, I think I saw a statistic that said there's the greatest diversity of fish in rivers, even though, in fact, it's just a tiny part of the Earth's total water mass.
Yes, it's less than 1,000th. I think it's 1/20,000th of the water on Earth. The water that flows in our freshwater sources, whether it's lakes, rivers, ponds, pools, and so on, altogether, all that fresh water, which is still everywhere in the landscape. We couldn't imagine a landscape without fresh water, without a pond, without a ditch, a pool, a river. We all live near rivers. Most French departments are named after rivers or streams or bodies of water. And yet all of that is less than 1/20,000th of the water on Earth, and the vast majority of that water is found in the Great American Lakes, Lake Baikal and the Amazon. So actually our rivers are even less than that. So it's really very little in terms of the volume it occupies on the surface of the planet. Fresh water, and at the same time it's very little. We don't know all fish species as new ones are found daily. Still, we have an estimate of their total with about the same number discovered in both sea and freshwater. But if we count, there are more than 30,000 fish species, with about half in the sea and half in freshwater, just a little bit more in the sea. A few percent more, so that means that in a volume 20,000 times smaller, there are just as many fish species in freshwater. So, biodiversity is 20,000 times more concentrated in freshwater than in seawater. And here, fish are just one example, but if we looked at other categories of animals, it would be similar. Fish are just the most visible. They're among the largest aquatic animals, so it's easy to study fish, but it's true for life in general. And how is that possible? It's a mystery that hasn't been completely solved yet, because there are probably a lot of factors. One of the most obvious factors is that freshwater is very fragmented, very broken up compared to the sea. If you're a fish, you look at a globe from a fish's point of view. Well, here, you can't really see it very well. But there's only one ocean. We say seas, oceans. But you can swim from one place to another, maybe passing through straits, but you can always go from one place to another. So actually, a fish won't necessarily do that because it's used to a certain range of temperatures. So for example, a tropical fish from the Caribbean won't be able to go to tropical waters in Polynesia, because to do that it would have to go through the North Pole. That's too cold, and so is Tierra del Fuego or the Cape of Good Hope, but it's the same story. So unfortunately there are now canals in Suez and Panama that still mix the oceans, and that brings problems. But basically, from a fish's point of view, there are two oceans, the Indo-Pacific and the Atlantic, which includes the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Baltic. All of that is connected. And so two oceans mean that within the same ocean, the population is still quite homogeneous. You generally find the same species. Whereas in rivers, if you take a river like the Rhone, a river or another river like the Loire, which by the way are not very far from each other at the source of the Loire, the streams that flow into the Rhone and the streams that flow into the Loire are separated by just a few hundred meters. Afterwards, they separate, but that's how it is. You take two nearby streams. Inside, a fish from one has no way to get into the other, and vice versa, unless it goes through the sea or over land. Some species do that, but it's still very rare and very difficult. Or through the air, but that's still very complicated. So it creates areas that are isolated, what we call watersheds, and they've been isolated from each other for thousands of years. In France, these areas have been isolated from each other since the Ice Age, so for more than 10,000 years. And so in 10,000 years, we have species like this that appear because they're isolated, and that creates a very large diversity. Rivers are like an archipelago of many small islands separated from each other, and you can see it on islands. Endemic species, it's the same story.
And so, I also saw that rivers, and therefore the underwater ecosystem, play an extremely important role for wildlife, compared to forests. That's true?
Yeah, everything is connected. Everything is connected. The sea, the rivers, the forest, the land. There are actually a lot of exchanges of nutrients, chemical molecules and materials between these different entities. And often what we see is that the land needs what the sea has in abundance, and the sea needs what the land has in abundance. Each one lacks what the other has. Typically, marine life needs silica, and it's not easy to find silica in the sea. And that's what forms the basis of the shells of many marine plants and animals. The small diatoms, for example, those microscopic algae that feed the entire food chain, they need a frustule, which is a kind of small silica shell, and they can't always find it easily. It's not a common material, a chemical element that's common in water. So that's why rivers, which carry this kind of thing into the sea through erosion, end up greatly nourishing the ocean. It's estimated that more than half of the commercial species we fish, for example, need a river at some point. I think a third of fish species need these river inputs. They grow near river mouths and so on. The productivity it brings is really huge thanks to this exchange from land to sea, but the reverse exchange also exists. It's even more obvious. That is to say, the sea also brings nutrients to the land that the land needs, especially plants. Typically, it's mainly nitrogen and phosphorus that plants absolutely need to live. And to begin with, the food chain that feeds us. And at first, that's how the soil was fertilized with nitrogen and phosphorus. This was especially the case in Europe at the end of the Ice Age, when the glaciers retreated and the rock was bare. What fertilized the soil were the marine animals that came back via the rivers, mainly migratory fish, so fish like salmon. Do you know the story of the salmon? They grow up in the sea, but they swim back up the river where they were born to reproduce. And it's a long journey, it tires them out. Many die in some species, and in others, like the Atlantic salmon, they all die. Some manage to survive and go back down, but many of them die. They are carried off by predators, bears, herons, foxes, and then the carcasses eventually decompose into the soil. And actually that means these salmon, which have absorbed a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the sea as they grew, swim back up the rivers, and then some of them are going to die there. Their bodies will decompose, and all that nitrogen and phosphorus will end up in the soil. And that's true for salmon, it's true for shad, sea trout, and a lot of migratory fish like that. And that's what actually kick-started our terrestrial ecosystems in Europe, North America, and Northern Asia. Also in the temperate regions that were previously covered by ice. And even today, in places where there are still a lot of salmon and where the land emerged from the ice not long ago. In Canada, for example, there are studies that show the diversity of trees, the diversity of fields and birds in the forests. In short, the health of forest ecosystems, of terrestrial ecosystems, is correlated with the amount of salmon that swim up the rivers. Even to the point that the tree rings, which show how and how fast the tree grew, are 1.5 millimeters thicker. The years when a lot of salmon swim upstream, so on a tree cross section you can see not only the harsher or milder winters and so on as usual, but in addition whether or not there was salmon, because the tree, the paper, it's basically salmon at its core. So in Europe, unfortunately, salmon have almost disappeared. In any case, the population is less than 1/10,000th of what it was before the first dams. But other processes have taken over from the plants that fix nitrogen, etc. But actually, with the disappearance of salmon, nitrogen and phosphorus were scarce for a long time and posed a major challenge for agriculture. And in the Middle Ages, there weren't really any ways to enrich the soil with that, except by leaving fields fallow for a long time so that plants could fix nitrogen with their roots. Or plants like legumes do that quite well, beans, things like that. But we didn't really have a solution. And that's why later on in the 19th century, we imported guano. So actually bird droppings, seabird droppings from all the regions where they could be found, mainly the upwelling zones, so the areas where ocean currents bring up nutrients, specifically silica, which feeds the marine ecosystem. There are lots of birds that feed, they gather in colonies, and then they do what they have to do. That produces tons of droppings. And so Chile and Peru, it's always on the east side of the continents because of the prevailing winds. Upwelling zones like that are on the east side of continents. So the east of Africa, the east of South America, the east of many islands in Oceania. They collected guano in these areas and shipped it to Europe and North America to fertilize fields. And for almost a century more, there were even wars because of that. Actually, it was the sea that was also nourishing the soil, but indirectly like that. And then we had these bird colonies. Actually, we destroyed them by plundering the guano because they nested in the guano. It was their own nesting substrate. It kills bacteria. It's full of ammonia. It kills parasites. So these birds nested there, and it takes thousands of years of birds to create thick layers of guano. So once we removed the guano, these birds collapsed. And that's when the Germans developed processes to make nitrogen fertilizer from natural gas and air. There's nitrogen in the air, dinitrogen, but it's stable. So a whole chemical process was needed to break it down and turn it into compounds that plants can use and that we can eat. In fact, so after that, the Germans at the beginning of the 20th century developed the Haber-Bosch process. And that's the beginning of industrial agriculture. So now there's no longer this idea that the land, at least our cultivated land, is hungry for what the sea provides. On the contrary, they're overloaded with nitrogen. Because we produce a lot, we use way too much fertilizer, and with this fertilizer we grow way too many plants that we use to feed tons of animals. And these animals digest, and that produces slurry, which we put back on the fields to produce even more. So now we've saturated the soil with nitrogen. But for millennia, it's only been like this for a few years, since after the war, but before that it was really completely different. This balance between the ocean and the land, and each one needs what the other provides. And you can still see it in some regions. It's funny. Well, take the Amazon, for example. Why is the Amazon so green and so rich, even though it's at latitudes where there are often deserts? Still, when you look at it, there are already the Andes for the water. It's the Andes that block the clouds and make them condense there. But water alone isn't enough to make it rich. On the contrary, water will actually wash away the nutrients. So in theory, for it to be that rich, there has to be a supply of nutrients. And what is one of the main sources of nutrients at that level, especially phosphorus? Actually, it's wines coming from the Sahara that bring sands from the Sahara to the Amazon in very, very large quantities. And what do these Sahara sands contain? They contain fish bones, the remains of fish bones from the time when the Sahara wasn't a desert but a swamp. That wasn't so long ago, about 8,000 years. There were already humans and even civilizations. But 8,000 years ago, the Sahara was mostly a vast swamp where there were a lot of fish. These fish, well, now it's dried up, but there are still tons of sediments left, mainly the remains of the bones and hydroxyapatite. The phosphorus precipitates from these bones end up scattered like that. That feeds the Amazon, creating many exchanges. It's interesting that from a chemical and physicochemical view, everything on the globe is connected. An old fish from thousands of years ago is going to feed the Amazon, which will indirectly feed us through soybeans or unfortunately things like that that we will eat. In the end, everything is connected.
So I'm extrapolating a bit, but does that also mean that the more we reduce biodiversity in aquatic environments, the more we become dependent on fertilizers that we add to the fields?
Yes, that's not extrapolating at all. That's exactly it. It's direct. In fact, all this aquatic biodiversity allows us to have very rich environments, and that's what it typically provided. If we still had large salmon runs, we would probably have quite sustainable agriculture around the alluvial plains, forests, rivers, and so on. Today, we rely on very polluting chemical processes to feed ourselves, which make us dependent on gas and therefore on countries that are not always democratic and so on. So yes, it's clear that the moment we chose this chemical process to make fertilizer, instead of trying a bit of moderation and using guano intelligently, which the Incas had done for millennia, because guano, it was rediscovered by Humboldt, a German navigator and naturalist in the 1800s. He was traveling along the coast of Peru, and actually he rediscovered this, whereas before that no one knew how the Incas had been so rich and prosperous while living in an extremely arid and inhospitable desert. And in fact, we have now rediscovered it. We know very well that they had these bird islands where they collected guano and used it. And that was the basis of their agriculture, so of their energy, their population, and so on. Even though they didn't even master the wheel, the Incas never mastered the wheel, and yet they managed to build a prosperous civilization right in the middle of the desert. But on the other hand, they had extremely strict rules. If someone killed these seabirds, the punishment could go as far as the death penalty if you didn't protect them or respect the nesting season, for example. And so this guano, they understood that it was a resource that renewed itself very, very slowly and that it needed to be taken care of.
Okay, regarding the salmon, do we know what caused their, well, not their disappearance, but their decline compared to before?
Yes, we absolutely know. In fact, the decline of salmon started in the 1400s and 1500s. So it's actually very old, with the first water mills that allowed small streams to be blocked. At first, it was to make flour or to grind things, basically to get energy like that from water. And as soon as we started that, we know, because we see it in archives, human food, but also in archaeological digs near rivers, ridges, and so on. We know the salmon population began declining from then on. Then it's mainly the dams. It accelerated with the industrial era, when we really started building hydroelectric dams. That's when we blocked entire rivers. Blocking just the small tributaries still allowed salmon to get through. Blocking the entire river stops them completely. And alongside that, there's overfishing, there's pollution, obviously, which is always present. And today we think that the main factors causing this decline, not only has it not stopped, but it continues and may even be accelerating. Today then it's getting worse and worse, while very, very few salmon are coming back. A few years ago, as a joke, I used to talk about the dour salmon, which was once legal to fish and available in restaurants and from caterers. I used to say you shouldn't eat that. It's like eating panda, and it's true that no one would think of eating a panda. We all know it's an endangered animal, and even if it probably tastes good, it would taste like bamboo shoots. We wouldn't eat panda, so I told them it's like eating panda. It's just as endangered today. Since this year, it's no longer a joke, it's no longer a metaphor. There are actually fewer dour salmon than pandas coming back each year. Fishing is closed, but that's not enough, because the problem is there are still issues with fishing. But since salmon spend much of their lives at sea, not fishing them in rivers won't make a big difference. In fact, it gets caught by nets near the coast that aren't meant for it, but that kill a lot of fish. That's one of the main problems. And so all these factors combined mean that today there are 10,000 times fewer salmon than before the decline. So you have to imagine that if today someone catches a salmon, and it happens, people who fish in the Dawa, for example, even when they're fishing for trout, they sometimes catch a salmon. You have to realize that when they catch a salmon, if they had been fishing in 1500, they would have caught 10,000 with the same fishing effort. By spending maybe a few days to catch one, they would have caught 10,000. We can't even imagine what that's like. 10,000 salmon, it wouldn't just fill a room, it would fill several rooms. It's unimaginable. On top of that, they were much bigger, so that's even more volume. It's something we can't even imagine. And a single fisherman would catch 10,000. So you have to imagine what it was like in the rivers, what it fed, the stench there must have been when the carcasses started to die, but also the richness of life it brought, which fed an entire ecosystem. It's absolutely incredible, but unfortunately, we made it disappear.
And are there any solutions that exist, or is the path we've taken somewhat inevitable?
For this specific point, the solutions are simple. There are more complicated issues. Salmon seems to be suffering from climate change, but not that much, because in this case, the solution is complicated. Or rather, it's difficult to implement. But for salmon, no, we need to stop the fisheries that are likely to catch salmon. And clearly, none of us needs to eat those fish. There are plenty of other alternatives, both for fishermen and for consumers. So it's really not complicated to implement, and we need to do what other countries have already done for a long time, which is to remove the nets from the coastal zone, like in the United States, a country that's not exactly known for being environmentally friendly. The Golden Mile has existed since the 1980s. So a mile, which is about 2 kilometers along the coast, about 1.8 kilometers in a mile, there are no nets. And so fish like salmon can pass through like that using these migration corridors. And they have perfectly viable salmon populations that are doing well. In Alaska, there is salmon that is even fished in large quantities in a very sustainable way. So that's the kind of regulation we're talking about. In this case, it's not complicated. It's rare to have environmental issues where we don't need a major upheaval. But unfortunately, even things like this, very small ones, we can't manage to put them in place. There are so many lobbies, interests, and stupid habits that politically today, it's hard to get things done. Even eels, which are on the verge of extinction and are the subject of fishing that hardly brings any profit to anyone, well, we can't manage to shut down this fishing.
And what is that due to?
It's due to lobbying resistance, local interests, and also a lack of understanding from politicians about the real issues. When you look at other countries like the United States, or even closer to us, England, or farther away, Australia and New Zealand, culturally, we have other conservation lobbies, divers, anglers, artisanal fishermen, who have managed to get the attention of politicians. Getting the attention of politicians isn't that hard. There's one word that makes them turn off their hearing aids, and that's the word money. They don't care as long as we're discussing something else. And so over there, what they managed to show them, and which is totally proven by economics, is that a fish caught by an industrial fisherman brings in 100 to 1,000 times less than a live fish. Or a fish caught by an artisanal fisherman, a line fisherman. The difference between the two is between 10 and 1,000 times in terms of what it brings to the economy, because a fish caught by an industrial fisherman only brings in its price per kilo. That's it. It doesn't go any further. And these are fishing methods that are very costly in terms of energy, en essence, in fuel, in subsidies also. Because these big boats, someone still has to invest in them, and usually it's the government. And then someone has to invest to scrap them, to modernize them, so it's extremely expensive. Basically, if we removed the subsidies, industrial fishing wouldn't be viable today. And on top of that, it brings in very little. Here's the price per kilo, usually 10 euros at most for the most sought after species. That's about it at auction. On the other hand, a fish caught in an artisanal way directly supports the person who catches it with much lower costs and very few subsidies. And then a fish caught by a weekend fisherman is even better, even if it's never sold. In the end, because it's a whole leisure economy, he'll buy ingredients to cook it, or if he releases it, even better, it could be caught multiple times. That increases the effect. But he'll buy the boat, he'll buy the equipment, maybe the hotel, the guide, the drinks, etc. In short, it's a whole economy that works like that. And by a diver, even better, if there's diving ecotourism, that can happen too, even better. So that ecosystem service over there, they manage to make the decision makers understand it. Unfortunately, not here, and we often hear people saying, no, but this. It's unfair for a fish to be caught by a recreational fisherman because it doesn't bring in any money, while there are people for whom it's their job. You hear things like that, but if you look at the whole economy as a whole, no, they're completely wrong. And similarly, they often say, it's unfair that beyond fishing, a species is protected when it could provide a livelihood for people whose job it is, except that a protected species actually supports even more people. In general, through all the benefits it brings, the ecosystem services.
All right, so to go back a bit to the common misconceptions we have about fish, there's one misconception that's quite persistent. There's a question someone asked me to ask you. At the same time, it's often said that goldfish have a pretty short memory, and even fish in general are said to have a short memory. Is that true, or is it just a misconception?
Yes, that's a misconception. People often mention the 3-second idea, suggesting the fish forgets by the time it swims around the bowl. No, that's not true at all. It was made popular a bit by the movie Nemo but well, it's funny, but it's not true. Fish have a good memory. They remember things for several months, even several years, depending on the species. That's what science proves. There are experiments about this, and they do remember. Yes, they're not animals as intelligent as we are, that's for sure, even though there are some fish that have quite interesting cognitive abilities, and we keep discovering more about them. You don't necessarily have to compare intelligence, by the way. We know how to solve math problems or build rockets that go to the moon. But other animals with a different brain, probably less developed, but with abilities that are just as interesting, can achieve some really amazing feats. Also, for example, a salmon can detect, to use salmon as an example, from the North Sea or Greenland, the smell of its native river and follow its trail back even though there are turbulences in the ocean. It's not a straight line, it's not just that, it smells, then it gets stronger and so on. Plus there's a factor that physicists have modeled, which is entropy. It will be able to follow an entropy gradient of the smell to reach the stream where it was born. And it remembers that because it's in its memory. 3 or 4 years earlier, when it left the river, it memorized that smell. So it's this kind of intelligence that's quite amazing, but we can't compare it to ours.
Yes, regarding intelligence, do fish have communication systems, a language?
Yes, not just one. There are many communication systems among fish. Langage, it all depends on what we mean by language. But if we're talking about the idea of signs in a symbolic language, then maybe fish don't have that. Other animals might. We see that monkeys, for example, have calls that correspond to different predators and different situations. So there is a language when they call out arpiferos or when they call out jaguar. It's not the same call. So here maybe we can talk more about language, but in the end it all depends on how we agree on the definition of language. But fish, so that apparently not, but communicating and conveying information to each other and exchanging it, they have plenty of ways to do that. Many fish make noise. Despite the idea of a silent world, water actually carries sound much better than air. There are a lot of fish that make a lot of noise in many different ways, whether it's grunting, using their swim bladder, or even little herrings making noises through flatulence. It helps them communicate with each other. Yes, absolutely, yes, because there is also communication between species, but in this case, it's within the same species. We don't know what they're saying, and maybe we don't want to. It's their business. So there are plenty of ways to communicate through sound, but also a lot through pheromones. So scents that have meaning. A funny story about that. C, alarm pheromones. So there are plenty of small fish that will release alarm pheromones to warn their fellow fish when they're injured or attacked by a predator. And there are even some that actually know it will attract even more predators if they do it, and yet they still do it anyway. When they're captured by a predator, because they keep releasing a lot of it, other predators show up, they fight over the prey, and the prey has a chance to escape at that moment. So there are tricks like that. And the funniest one is the pike that lives in our waters. And the Native Americans had noticed for a very long time that pikes never digest in the same place where they hunt. Well, this was only studied by science quite recently, but there have been experiments done. Even in controlled environments, it was found to be systematic. The pike, it takes its digestion break in a place opposite to where it goes to hunt. And actually, that's because when it swallows its prey, they're always still a bit alive, and its stomach ends up full of alarm pheromones. And so in its droppings, and if the prey smell the pike's droppings, it scares them. So it goes to the bathroom as far away from its kitchen as possible. It's pretty funny from its pantry anyway. So pheromones are a way that fish use to communicate. Then it also has body attitudes. For example, to get cleaned by a cleaner fish, there's a whole ritual of gestures. So it's absolutely interspecies, but also between species during reproduction and so on. There are all kinds of gestures between males and females, between males fighting each other and so on. There's also color, and a lot of fish actually change color, a bit like octopuses. They have chromatophores, cells that can expand in different colors, like pixels, and they can change color. Eye color conveys information, and there are other senses, simply movements and so on. There are quite a few ways like that for fish to communicate, a lot actually.
Colors. That surprises me because it seemed to me that in the ocean, as soon as you go down just a little bit in depth, there's immediately very little light. How do they manage to see colors in an environment where light doesn't travel very well?
So it's mainly for species that live in shallow waters where there is light, but indeed as soon as you go deeper, there's very little light. Colors disappear one after another, starting with the warmer ones like red. At 5 meters, there's already no more red, and then the light also disappears very quickly. At 400 meters, there's almost no light left, and at 1000 meters, there's zero sunlight. So, well, first of all, most of it happens near the surface, the species that communicate using colors. Second, they have a wider range of visible colors than we do, so they can even see ultraviolet. In general, fish can see ultraviolet very well. This lets them have colors that are less absorbed by water and less deep, giving a slight advantage even if similar. Ultraviolet rays also vanish completely after a certain depth. And then finally, in great depths, some fish will emit their own light, so that allows them to do so. That's why abyssal fish, they still have eyes, even though they live at depths where there is no light at all. From the sun, it's that they have eyes to see bioluminescence, so the light emitted by other creatures, well, by the animals themselves.
Okay, which means that actually, depending on the depth we're at, we have ecosystems that can be completely different from one depth to another.
Yes, we have very different environments because there are very different physical laws, because there are very different conditions, especially in terms of light. And above all, what does light bring? It brings life through plants, through photosynthesis, it brings food. The primary producer, a food chain, it always starts with plants that take in light and carbon monoxide, and turn them into sugars. And then we can eat those sugars and then be eaten by another who will eat. And so on land, there are 3 or 4 levels: a plant, an herbivore, a carnivore. Usually it stops there, but in the sea, there are dozens and dozens of levels that eat each other. But it always starts with the sun and with plants, except that if you go too deep, there's no more sun, no more plants. So what's going to happen? 2 things: vertical migration, so most of the species that live in what we call the mesopelagic zones, so it's not really the abyss, but it's not the surface either. They go up every day to eat plants and go back down every night to escape predators. And so there's a whole cycle like that, the phytoplankton. The plants will move in the opposite direction, going down at night and up during the day, and the animals will go up mostly at night and down during the day. This means it can happen over thousands of meters sometimes. So it's the largest migration by biomass in the living world. This happens every night in the ocean to catch this food. And that's actually what makes the ocean capture carbon monoxide. 2, we say the ocean is our ally against global warming. It captures carbon monoxide too. But how does it do that? Actually, it's all these plants on the surface that take in carbon monoxide through photosynthesis and store it in their bodies. Then the animals come to eat and the plants go down. They digest it deep down. We're talking a lot about digestion today, but it's fundamental because as a result, they digest it in depth. And what happens then? It falls to depths where it doesn't come back up for centuries, even millennia. Because the ocean isn't just a homogeneous layer of water, it's like a cake. There are layers, and you can trap things below certain layers of deep water, of cold, somewhat dense water. And that's how carbon gets sequestered, and that's how it happens. Also, when animals die, their carbon falls like that into the depths. What we call marine snow is all this debris that falls from the surface and feeds the deeper abysses. And then much lower down, where there's no light at all, there's still oxygen, because oxygen also comes from plants. Plants have produced so much of it for so long that there's oxygen down there. But there's no light at all, so the animals that are really deep in the aquatic zones where there's no light, either they eat marine snow or they eat other creatures that eat marine snow, or what do? They have nothing to eat. And so, fortunately, life finds a way. There's another way in the great depths to bypass this whole system based on light and to have primary producers on another principle, which is chemosynthesis. So this happens in black smokers. These are those hydrothermal vents, basically geysers, but underwater, where water gushes out, but under the sea, and it carries a lot of chemical elements in these vents. It's very, very hot water, well above 100 degrees, but since we're at depths with high pressure, The water actually boils at much higher temperatures than that. So it's not boiling water, but it's very, very, very hot. And it causes chemical reactions, and actually there are bacteria that use the energy from these chemical reactions, mainly based on sulfur. Like in all geysers, there's sulfur. Thanks to this energy, they're able to synthesize sugars and also start a food chain. So it's a kind of life that's completely parallel to all the life we know on the planet. It's completely crazy, and it gives us clues about the origin of life in these environments, which are unfortunately threatened today. Since many chemical reactions occur in these environments, they precipitate, and there are companies that actually want to exploit these metals. That would seriously endanger the ocean's entire balance.
Okay, because since everything is interconnected, if we start disrupting everything at the base, we end up causing a chain reaction that disrupts all the ecosystems.
Exactly, such exploitation carries a lot of dangers. First, we will destroy ecosystems that have a completely separate existence, and that probably hold the secret to the origin of life. That's probably where life appeared, and so there are secrets there as well. For us, for our healing, to better understand our bodies, and for all kinds of technologies that could benefit us, because we know very little about everything that's there. We know less than 10% of all the species in the ocean, especially in those areas where they are very interesting. So that's already a big danger. Then indeed, we're going to disrupt a piece of the puzzle. We're going to push one of the dominoes and everything could collapse, especially since it's not just one domino. Because if we start scraping in those areas, it will create clouds of sediment that will impact the entire water column above. So it's more than just a domino. It's more like an elephant walking across the domino board.
All right, regarding those species, how can we study them considering they're at such a great depth? It's very complicated to send expeditions or submarines there. How can we collect information and see how these ecosystems are evolving?
There are robots, actually. It's done remotely, so they're underwater robots with articulated arms that come and capture specimens. They film, observe, take measurements, collect samples, and so on. For now, that's what we use because we can go to those depths with submarines and humans, but it's still very complicated and dangerous.
I've heard that at those depths there are fish that can reach completely enormous sizes. Is that true, or is it just a legend?
These environments have little nutrition, so not much grows large. Because, as we were saying, apart from marine snow and black smokers, there aren't many sources of food. There's another one, because you can't really call it marine snow. It's a bit too big for snow. It's the whales that die. Whale carcasses create oases of life, so it can feed animals, fish that can grow up to about 1 meter long for several months. Because a dead whale is a lot of food mass, but there aren't that many really big animals in the deep sea. And the ones that are there will have a very slow-paced life. Because as a result, they really have to save energy all the time. Yes, there are big sharks that can be 2 meters long or more, but they live very, very slowly. We're discussing depths near black smokers about 2,000 meters down. Even lower, there's much less life, and it's getting smaller and smaller. And all these animals, the lanternfish, things like that, which we usually depict as very monstrous, are actually really small. Because yes, it's disappointing. It's a bit like penguins. We watch movies and get the impression that they're 8 feet tall, that they're bigger than humans. March of the Emperor, and then actually they're just big chickens. The emperor penguin is about the size of a turkey. It's a bit disappointing, even though it's adorable, it makes them cuter, but still it's kind of the same. You might think they're huge, but they're not. There are, however, some truly enormous things in the ocean. Indeed, they do live at great depths, but not at those kinds of depths. They're more around 100 meters, 300 meters, 1,000 meters max. Let's say giant squids, for example. That's not a fish, but it's a gigantic animal. Giant squids, colossal squids. They can be more than 10, 12 meters long. They don't live at the very bottom of the Mariana Trench. They live more between 300 and 1,000 meters. Same with the oarfish. So that's a very, very long fish that gave rise to lots of sea serpent legends. It's so long, like the snake in the video game Snake, that really old boomer video game. This snake can bite its own tail and eat itself when it's low on nutrients. So it practices autotomy, and it's able to. Usually you always find them with the tip of their tail missing, because we don't know exactly if it always eats it or if sometimes it's like lizards escaping predators, but apparently that's what they do. So it's a large ribbon-like fish that can exceed 10 meters and typically lives around 100 meters deep. It's in those areas where there's really mystery and life. and a huge, huge biomass because it's the zone where it can come up to the surface to take advantage of what the light produces and then go back down. The most abundant fish in the world is in that zone. Which one is it? The cyclothone. Nobody knows it. The number, but it doesn't mean anything to anyone. I think it's a 1 with 16 zeros after it. So how many are there? It's a lot.
How big is it?
It's about this size. It's at most 15 centimeters, let's say. It lives in very large schools. It has big teeth. It's a bit like an anchovy, but with big teeth. And nobody had even noticed it until a few years ago when we realized it was the largest, most numerous fish in the world. The most abundant, I think that was in 2015.
Okay, so it's still pretty recent and it's the most abundant.
And it's proof that there are still so many things to discover in the ocean. It's more abundant, and thank God. No one is exploiting it because it's still at depths that are too great for that, around 300 or 400 meters. And we hope that won't be the case because it surely plays an unsuspected but enormous role.
Speaking of superlatives, do we know how big the largest marine animal is, the largest fish?
So maybe we'll discover even bigger ones. That's the beauty of it, and I mean that sincerely. It's not to start talking about cryptozoology or dreams of Loch Ness monsters, but because, for example, the megamouth shark, which is over 7 meters long, is an incredible plankton-eating shark with a phosphorescent mouth to attract plankton. It was discovered in the late 1970s. So it gives us an idea of the hope we have to discover many more things in the ocean. So the largest marine fish is the whale shark, so it's easy to spot. It lives mostly near the surface, and it's also a plankton-eating shark that can grow. I think it's 18 meters, something like that. Well, almost close to the size of a whale, but to be checked. Maybe around 15 meters anyway, it's pretty big. The largest bony fish, so the family of fish closer to us, because that's a cartilaginous fish. The whale shark belongs to the shark family, which is quite distant. The largest bony fish is the sunfish, which can weigh 2 tons. That's pretty big too. Similarly, it's not a plankton eater. It feeds on jellyfish and other gelatinous creatures, so it lives quite peacefully. Let's say after that, the largest animal of all is not a fish, because actually a fish, most fish, except for a few exceptions like the bluefin tuna, are cold-blooded, so they're at the same temperature as the water. But if we want a really, really big animal, we need an animal that can live in cold places. Because that's where, near the poles, there's wind for 6 months out of the year. And so there can be big phytoplankton blooms, large developments of food. In fact, the ocean is much more nutritious near the poles than near the equator. So the whale shark, which lives in warm waters, can grow very large, but it can't reach its maximum, the absolute maximum. You need an animal that can live near the poles for much of the year. And a cold-blooded animal that would do that, its metabolism would be slowed down by the cold, so it wouldn't be effective at doing that. So physically, this is an example of how physics dictates the shape of nature. Physically, the largest animal in the world has to be warm-blooded, live near the poles, and live in the water. It can't be a dinosaur or an elephant because on land, gravity limits the size of animals. Why? Because the cross-section of the bones increases more slowly than the mass of the animal. The animal's mass grows with the cube of its length as it's a volume, while bone cross-section grows with the square of the length being a surface. And so actually, if you increase the size of an animal proportionally, at some point it will break, the bones will break. Even an elephant can't jump over a curb. You'll never see an elephant jump. It just can't. It would break its bones. So this phenomenon totally limits the size of animals on land. So they have to live in water. They have to live near the poles. They have to be warm-blooded. We're getting pretty close to a whale now. And actually, the whale is the largest animal that has ever existed. Over 30 meters for blue whales. And we've just found a fossil of an animal that, judging by the size of its vertebrae, seems to be a bit bigger than the blue whale. But it was also a whale, actually, and in fact, our whales, we know that they already reach, even the blue whale. Another physical limit, as we were saying, is being warm-blooded. Well, actually, the problem with the whale is precisely overheating. Because when you increase the size of a warm-blooded animal, as I was saying earlier, the volume increases much faster than the surface area. Actually, the animal's volume, its muscle mass, that's what produces heat, and the surface area is what releases the heat. So what happens then If you double the size of a whale, the surface area will be 4 times larger if you double the length of a whale. But the volume, on the other hand, will be 4 times 2, so that's 8 times, so the volume will be 8 times greater. So after a while, actually, the surface area won't be enough to get rid of the heat, and so that means whales are constantly overheating. If you kill a whale, you're not supposed to, but when the Eskimos kill a whale to eat it, it cooks by itself just because of all the heat that's built up, which can't get out anymore. Because actually it's the whale's heart, by constantly pumping blood to the outside, that cools it down and keeps it from overheating. So if you kill it, it cooks, and that's how much a whale overheats. It's always on the verge of overheating. Likewise, very small warm-blooded animals are constantly at risk of hypothermia. The smallest mammal, the Etruscan shrew, which is lighter than a 1-cent coin, it eats every half hour. It has to eat. It has an extremely fast heartbeat, a very fast metabolism. And if it stops eating for half an hour, it faints from hypothermia. And you just have to put it in your hand. The warmth of your hand is enough to revive it, and it's so small, it's cute. But yes, small animals have a problem with the cold. Even an infant, a newborn, gets much colder. You have to warm it up more than a full-sized adult human. And it's the same for a whale. So that's the limit. We don't know what kind of very large animals there are left to discover under the ocean, but we do know what the limit is for the largest one we'll ever find.
Earlier, we also said that below a certain depth, animals have a metabolism that runs at a slower rate. Does that mean they live longer?
Often, yeah, it's actually related. Because they're in colder water, so all the chemical reactions in their bodies happen more slowly, including oxidation processes, aging, and so on. So quite often in the deep sea, we have fish in particular, but animals in general that live longer. We even have, among the records, some very long lifespans. Well, there isn't really a record because there are some jellyfish that are immortal, but there are animals that live to be very old, like certain sponges and worms. These are sponges that live in great depths, and they have a magnificent skeleton. And it has been calculated, thanks to this skeleton in worms, that some individuals were 17,000 years old. So while we were painting mammoths in caves, the sponge was already there. And as for vertebrates in the depths, not in great depths, it's more in cold waters. We have sharks that can live more than 800 years. The Greenland shark has been measured. We know that individuals have been found and dated at 500 years old, but since those were far from the largest ever caught, the biggest ones were probably over 800 years old. So there are sharks today that ate Vikings and are still swimming because they feed on dead animals. So a Viking who falls into the water probably tastes the same as a dead seal that they usually eat. Today you can eat a shark that ate a Viking. It's not good, but it's an Icelandic specialty. They let them rot because they're toxic, they're full of ammonia, and to remove the urea and break it down, they let it rot underground. Actually, for 6 months, they make little cubes out of it that are used like appetizers, and it tastes like a desktop. Mixed with cod liver oil, it's really disgusting, but yes, it exists. There you go. These are animals that live for more than 800 years. It's pretty crazy to think about that. Witnesses like that, all the things they've been able to see or not see, because after a while they end up going blind. They have parasites that settle in their eyes. Well, they sense electricity differently. All that, and yeah, it's crazy. And it's related to the great depths. And that's why, by the way, deep sea fishing, it takes a very long time for them to mature and reproduce. When you eat, for example, the fish called sebaste, which is often sold at the fish market and often under the name dorade sebaste, but it has nothing to do with dorade. It's a fish that only matures at over 20 or 30 years old, and it's not uncommon to buy one. In fact, it's over 100 years old, maybe even almost 200 years old. That means we're eating a fish that might have lived during Napoleon's time, which is strange. And so it's generally not very sustainable. There are a few fisheries that manage to really regulate, but in general, these deep sea fish are not very sustainable.
We're nearing the end of our interview. I always like to take a moment in the interview to talk about the books and the person we're inviting. You've written quite a few books, including one with a title that intrigued me. It's The Eloquence of the Sardine. It seems to me that a sardine can actually be eloquent.
We talked earlier about the many ways fish have to communicate. So yes, I think a sardine is very eloquent, especially since they managed to form schools together of several million individuals who make decisions all together without even having to talk to each other. If that's not the ultimate eloquence, being able to make a decision and choose a migratory route or escape a predator, altogether millions of them without speaking to each other, While we, even with debates, have trouble finding a prime minister, that's still great eloquence, in my opinion. It's not just about sardines, it's about the marine world, packed with stories, anecdotes, and ocean secrets.
Okay, and now you're writing another book that should be coming out in about a month.
This November 2025. About freshwater. So this somewhat hidden world, the lesser known counterpart of the ocean, but just as rich and varied. It also follows some very interesting physical laws related to water. And so it's a beautiful book published by Tana, which will be called Freshwaters. At least the title says exactly what it means, freshwaters in the plural. And in collaboration with Jan Arthus Bernard. So he provided the aerial photos of hundreds of freshwater locations around the world, often quite spectacular. And for each aerial image, I tell the story of what's seen from below. So the amazing and hidden life of animals, plants, and unsuspected creatures that live in freshwater.
Thanks a lot. We'll link the book in the description for anyone interested. In any case, thank you very much for this interview, which was extremely interesting. Subtitles, thank you. Thank you for watching the episode all the way through. Feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. See you soon.